We live in a world that treats constant motion as a virtue. Answer the message right away. Show up, say yes. And if you turn down plans after a long, draining day, you risk being called distant or difficult or worse, lazy. So when a new day starts and some quiet part of you just wants to stay home a little longer, you probably feel a flicker of guilt before you even decide anything. I want to offer you a different way of looking at that feeling. What if it's not a problem at all? What if it's actually one of the most intelligent signals your mind ever sends you? Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the last century, didn't see the need to withdraw from social life as some kind of regression. He saw it often as a sign of real psychological maturity, a moment when a person stops needing to perform a role and quietly returns to their own center, where something like genuine rest actually becomes possible. This isn't an argument for isolating yourself from the world. It's an invitation to notice that sometimes the most honest thing you can do for yourself is simply not force your way back out into it too quickly. 1. Staying home lets you set down the roles you carry all day. Staying home isn't just about closing a door. It's about stepping into the one place where nobody is watching, evaluating, or expecting anything specific from you. The moment that door closes, a whole invisible workload quietly falls away. The adjusting of your tone, the managing of your face, the constant, mostly unconscious calculation of what response is appropriate right now. It's only in that stillness that you start to notice just how many roles you've been carrying all day, and how tired you actually are from holding them up. Jung had a word for this performing self: the persona. It's the mask that lets us function inside a family, a workplace, a society. And the persona isn't a bad thing, it's necessary. The problem is when a person never has anywhere to take it off. Jung put it plainly: the persona is what a person is not, but what they and others believe them to be. At home, once there's no one left to perform for, you finally get the chance to feel the difference between the mask and the person actually wearing it. You see this same idea running through old mythology, too. Odin wanders the world under 100 different names and shapes, but it's only when he returns to Asgard that he reconnects with his own deeper wisdom. Every hero in every old story needs somewhere they don't have to be a hero. Modern psychology backs this up in its own language. The research on role strain shows that constantly adjusting your behavior to meet expectations burns through real cognitive and emotional energy. In a space where no performance is required, your nervous system finally gets to shift out of alertness and into actual recovery. You've probably felt this yourself. Some people spend an entire day speaking carefully, weighing every word, and by evening want nothing except to sit in silence in a familiar room. Some people get home and don't want to text anyone back, don't want to explain anything, don't want to be reachable in any way at all. That's not depression, and it's not avoidance by default. Often it's simply a persona that's been run past its limits, finally being set down before it does any real damage underneath. One woman who watches this channel told me she used to be the person who was always on time, who never forgot a birthday, who kept every relationship carefully maintained. Then came a stretch of time where she'd lie in bed for long parts of the day. Not from sadness exactly, just an overwhelming resistance to the idea of going out and seeing anyone. The thought of having to smile, listen, and never say no made her body feel heavy before the day had even started. She slowly stopped replying to messages, stopped showing up to things, and stayed inside her own space. And what she eventually realized was that it wasn't the people around her that had exhausted her. It was the agreeable role she'd been playing around them for far too long. Wanting to lie still wasn't escape. It was her own mind quietly forcing the mask off, even if just in silence. If a person never has a real place, physically or psychologically, and where they can simply be at home. Jung believed they'll gradually start to merge entirely with their social role. And that's usually when a strange emptiness creeps in. Not because life lacks purpose, but because the actual self no longer has any ground left to stand on. People keep functioning, keep showing up looking fine while quietly becoming strangers to themselves. So staying home isn't running from life. It's a kind of return to breathing that doesn't need adjusting, to feelings that don't need hiding, and to one very basic question. When I don't have to be anyone, who am I? That question is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of actually becoming yourself. And it can only continue if you occasionally give it room to breathe. 2. Staying home lets the shadow you've been avoiding finally come into view. Here's where it gets a little more uncomfortable, because peace usually isn't the first thing that shows up when you spend real time alone at home. Often what surfaces first is the psychological dust that daily life had been keeping stirred up and hidden. Things you've been quietly avoiding for years start drifting into view. Jung called this part of us the shadow. It isn't evil, and it isn't only made of negative impulses. It's simply every part of your personality that your conscious mind has refused to accept. Old fear of abandonment, buried anger, unspoken envy. The ache to be loved, even talents or desires you shut down long ago because they felt inappropriate at the time. The shadow doesn't form because a person is bad. It forms because a person has to adapt to survive. While you're out in the world, the shadow usually stays buried under conversations, obligations, and a packed schedule. But at home, when the pace slows and there's no one left to react to, that cover starts to fall away, and the shadow, which was never gone, just forgotten, starts finding its way back into view. Jung pointed out that the unconscious rarely speaks in clear sentences. It speaks through states. Restlessness with no obvious cause. Sadness that doesn't match anything happening in your life. Old memories resurfacing out of nowhere. I once worked with a woman, I'll call her Linda, whose outer life was completely stable. No crisis, nothing dramatic happening. But once she started spending more time alone, she noticed a sadness and irritability she couldn't explain. No one had heard her, which confused her even more. What eventually surfaced wasn't a new problem. It was old, suppressed emotion that had been waiting for the moment she'd stop needing to look fine in front of everyone. Solitude didn't create Linda's shadow. It just let the old covering finally fall away. What most people actually fear about spending long stretches of time home alone isn't loneliness. It's the presence of themselves with nothing left to distract from it. In that quiet, inner voices get louder. You might realize you've been angry at someone for a long time without ever letting yourself name it. You might notice how exhausted you are from maintaining an image of being fine. You might feel disappointment in yourself that you'd always pushed aside because it hurt too much to look at directly. It's easy to mistake all of this for a bad mood. Jung would say it's actually the shadow finally asking to be seen. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung once wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. That's not abstract philosophy. It's a precise description of what happens the moment you stay still long enough to stop running. The shadow doesn't come forward to destroy you. It comes forward because it wants a conversation. And here's the strange comfort in this. What we're most afraid to face alone is usually smaller than we imagined. We fear loneliness because we equate it with being abandoned. But inside the safety of home, we often realize it's simply an invitation to rest from constant performance. We fear old memories because we assume they'll only cause more pain, but when we let them surface gently, they usually aren't there to punish us. They're there to finally be resolved. The shadow only becomes dangerous when it's denied, not when it's seen. Whatever stays unconscious keeps quietly steering your choices, your reactions, your relationships from somewhere just out of view. At home in the quiet, you start to notice the mechanics of it. The outsized reaction to a small comment, the pattern you keep repeating in close relationships, the emotion you always seem to sidestep. These are all traces of the shadow, asking to finally be understood. Every time you can name a piece of it, it loses a little of its unconscious grip on you. It's a lot like walking into a dark room. Frightening at first because you can't see anything, but as your eyes adjust, shapes appear, and the room turns out to be far less dangerous than it felt in the dark. That's the shift Jung called moving from unconscious to conscious. The real foundation of psychological growth. None of this is about blaming yourself or deciding you're broken. It's the opposite. It's acknowledging that being a whole person means holding both the light and the dark parts of yourself, instead of only the parts that are easy to look at. 3. Staying home lets your own intuition finally develop. Jung didn't think of intuition as some vague gut feeling. He treated it as a real psychological function on equal footing with logic, emotion, and the senses. The mind's way of reaching toward what's forming beneath the surface, before rational thought is caught up enough to name it. The problem is, intuition can't grow in a noisy environment. When you're constantly explaining yourself, justifying decisions, and keeping pace with everyone around you, your mind naturally defaults to fast logic and immediate reactions. Intuition, which is subtle by nature, gets pushed to the back. It doesn't vanish, it just goes hungry. It's only when the pace slows, when no one's waiting on an immediate answer from you, that intuition gets the room it needs to surface. After enough real time alone, people start noticing signals that don't come from ordinary thinking at all. An unexplainable sense that something is off about a choice that looks fine on paper. A quiet, persistent pull away from a relationship that logically seems fine. A sudden clarity about direction that didn't come from analysis but simply arrived, fully formed, as a kind of knowing. For that inner voice to be heard, you need space that isn't crowded with other people's opinions and expectations. Interestingly, intuition doesn't grow by trying harder to listen to it. It grows by getting out of its way, by not constantly overriding it with rational justification. At home, alone, you don't have to explain your choices to anyone, rationalize your emotions, or defend yourself from judgment. That freedom from constantly justifying yourself creates the psychological softness intuition actually needs to function. Modern research supports this too. Studies on interoceptive awareness, our ability to sense internal bodily signals, show that people who get meaningful stretches of solitude tend to make decisions that align more closely with what they actually need, and staying home helps you tell the difference between real intuition and fear dressed up as instinct. In the middle of social pressure, fear is easy to mistake for a gut feeling. But in the calm of home, real intuition tends to feel different, quieter, less dramatic, less urgent. It doesn't need to convince you of anything. It just arrives as a kind of settled certainty. Jung warned that a person who completely cuts themselves off from intuition ends up living only half a psychological life, because intuition is exactly what guides us when logic alone isn't enough. And in the quiet of home, people slowly relearn how to trust their own inner signals again, not as blind belief, but as a relationship with themselves that has to be rebuilt piece by piece. 4. Staying home lets you reclaim energy that's been leaking outward for a long time. The first thing that actually happens when you stay home isn't rest. It's the slowing of energy that's constantly flowing outward. In everyday social life, your attention is always being pulled toward the outside world, responding, adapting, maintaining an image, keeping relationships steady. Even silence takes energy when you're performing the correct version of yourself while staying quiet. Jung's concept of psychological energy, what he called libido, wasn't limited to biological drive. It represented the life force behind your entire inner world. Capable of moving outward or turning back inward and prone to real imbalance when a person keeps giving without any real space to recover. Jung once observed that any kind of addiction, whether to a substance or to an ideal, is a form of the same problem. And constant unconditional presence for other people can become its own quiet form of energy depletion. At home, especially alone, that energy stops being pulled outward by expectation and starts turning back inward to actually nourish you. That's not selfishness. It's a natural act of self-balancing. Modern psychology describes something similar with the ideas of emotional depletion and attention fatigue. When you're constantly giving your attention and emotional labor to others, your internal reserves quietly run down, often surfacing later as irritability, emptiness, or exhaustion with no obvious cause. A low-stimulation environment like home lets your nervous system shift into genuine recovery, replenishing that reserve passively but powerfully. If a person never lets themselves reclaim that energy, they gradually become controlled by outside circumstances and other people's emotional weather. The self stops feeling like its own source and starts feeling like a transit station for everyone else's needs. A viewer named Henry once told me a story that captures this well. For years, he was the person everyone turned to. Co-workers pulled him aside to vent. Friends sent him long messages late at night after arguments. Family assumed he'd always understand. He listened to everything, remembered everything, carried everything, until his whole schedule was quietly built around other people's emotions. One especially exhausting evening, he finally told his group of friends he was genuinely depleted and just needed someone to listen to him for a few minutes. The message sat there. 10 minutes later, the conversation moved on to someone else's problem as if his hadn't happened at all. Staring at the screen, Henry realized something clearly for the first time. In these relationships, he wasn't seen as a tired human being. He was a safe container people poured their feelings into. That realization was what finally let him stop answering every call, stop making himself endlessly available, and start choosing to stay home more. Regular time at home helps you notice where your energy is actually going. After spending time with someone, do you feel fuller or more drained? After a day of constant interaction, how long does it take you to recover? These are questions you can only really answer once you're quiet enough to feel them. And that capacity to feel is the real foundation of healthy boundaries. Staying home, in this light, isn't just rest. It's reclaiming a kind of sovereignty over your own energy. Not to avoid life, but so life doesn't quietly drain you until you forget who you are underneath it. Once that energy genuinely returns, you can step back into the world with real presence, instead of showing up running on empty and borrowed vitality. 5. Staying home leads you toward a deeper understanding of who you actually are. Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. That's a long road, one that asks for ongoing inner effort rather than a single decision. But what if the pull to stay home on certain days is actually part of what leads you back to that privilege? Sometimes the urge to lie on the couch or sit quietly in front of a mirror is closely tied to a simple need. To remain with yourself, not to accomplish anything or prove anything, just to listen to what's unfolding underneath. Jung called this the opening signal of individuation. And individuation was never about becoming special or cutting yourself off from society. He described it as the slow process of freeing yourself from unconscious collective pressure, so you can live closer to your actual psychological structure. That doesn't happen through big, dramatic decisions. It happens through small, persistent inner shifts, a growing fatigue with living on autopilot, a fading interest in things that used to feel safe, a quiet, recurring question. If not this, then who am I? At this stage, staying home stops being simple rest and starts becoming something more like psychological empty space. Room where you're no longer required to constantly react to the outside world. That empty space matters because if your life stays permanently full of schedules and interactions and expectations, you never get the chance to notice what's actually running you on autopilot. Jung believed individuation always comes with some form of separation. Not physical separation from people, but separation from blind identification with what's expected of you. And that kind of separation almost never happens in a crowd. It needs silence. It needs a space where no one's watching. And no role has to be performed at all. That's why at pivotal moments in a person's life, the pull to stay home more often tends to intensify. People stop feeling the need to appear. They lose interest in explaining themselves. They no longer have the energy to keep up rhythms that used to feel completely normal. That's not collapse. It's an old structure losing its grip while the mind reorganizes itself underneath. You see the same pattern in mythology, which Jung treated as a kind of map for these deep psychological processes. Before a character truly becomes who they are, they almost always pass through some form of withdrawal. A cave, a mountain, a desert, some space removed from ordinary life. Not to learn more, but to face the emptiness inside themselves and reclaim their own strength. Myth quietly teaches something we tend to forget. A person only starts to really understand themselves when no one is watching. Staying home is the modern version of that same space. It doesn't ask you to be your best, most positive, most put-together self. It just asks you to stay in the process of becoming who you actually are. That kind of self-understanding doesn't come from thinking harder about yourself. It comes from directly noticing your own inner life. Given enough quiet, subtle things start to surface. A heaviness at the thought of an old, familiar path. An unexpected lightness imagining a different one. Sadness with no clear cause. A pull towards silence instead of another explanation. These signals are easy to miss when life moves fast, and impossible to miss once it slows down. Jung didn't see individuation as a climb upward. He saw it as a journey inward. Into contradictions you've never quite named. Choices you once dismissed as inappropriate. Parts of your inner life you once decided were inconvenient. And to make that journey, a person needs somewhere safe enough to finally put the defenses down. Staying home provides exactly that. And here's the paradox at the center of all of it. The more deeply you actually understand yourself, the less you feel the need to prove anything. You stop rushing to appear a certain way. You stop reacting so quickly. You stop fearing being misunderstood, not because you've risen above everyone else, but because you're standing more firmly inside your own life. That's one of the clearest signs that this process is actually working. The outside world no longer holds the only vote on who you are. So staying home in the end doesn't take you away from your life. It's what lets you come back to it, steadier. A little more whole and far more genuinely yourself than the version of you that never had anywhere to take the mask off. If this gave you a new way to understand your own need for stillness, subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring these ideas together. And in the comments, I'd genuinely like to know which of these 5 points hit closest to home for you right now. Sometimes just naming it is the first honest step back to yourself.